In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther circulated 95 arguments against the sale of indulgences by the Roman Catholic Church. Whether he actually nailed them to the church door in Wittenberg remains disputed, but what happened next is beyond dispute. Printers seized his words, translated them, shortened them, illustrated them, and carried them across Europe. Between 1517 and 1520, an estimated 300,000 copies of Luther's writings entered circulation. 300,000. A theological dispute became a mass movement. The authority of Rome fractured, wars followed, and Europe entered more than a century of religious conflict. The printing press receives most of the credit for this explosion, but the press required something cheap enough to print, light enough to transport, and abundant enough to sacrifice by the thousands. Paper. Today, you tear it from packages, wipe spills with it, scribble shopping lists on it, and throw it away without thinking. Yet this thin layer of crushed plant fibers once carried religions across continents, turned taxes into revolutions, made money possible without metal, and allowed empires to control millions of people from desks thousands of miles away. So how did a sheet worth almost nothing become one of history's greatest instruments of power? How did paper go from an imperial Chinese experiment to the material that taught civilizations to remember, calculate, command, and rebel? Luther's story begins in 1517. Paper's story begins roughly 17 centuries earlier in the workshops and tombs of Han Dynasty China. Before paper, writing was heavy, expensive, awkward, or all three. Mesopotamian scribes pressed reeds into wet clay tablets. The tablets survived fires remarkably well, because heat baked them harder, but transporting a large archive meant transporting a wall one brick at a time. Egyptians wrote on papyrus, a surface made by slicing the stalk of the papyrus plant, laying the strips in crossed layers, pressing them and drying them into sheets. The English word paper ultimately descends from the Greek word papyros, but papyrus and true paper are fundamentally different materials. Papyrus is a laminated plant sheet. Paper is a tangled web of separated fibers. Across the Mediterranean, animal skin became another important writing surface. Parchment could be durable, smooth, and reusable, but every page began with an animal. A large book might consume the skins of an entire herd. Across ancient India, scribes used birch bark and palm leaves. In China, they wrote on bamboo strips tied together with cord, on wooden tablets, and on silk. Silk was smooth and light. It was also expensive enough to serve as currency. Bamboo was cheaper, but brutally inconvenient. Imagine a government report composed on hundreds of narrow wooden strips, each tied to the next, then rolled into a bundle heavy enough to require a cart. Chinese officials were effectively carrying filing cabinets under their arms. This mattered because the Han Dynasty governed an enormous and increasingly bureaucratic state. Orders had to travel, taxes had to be recorded, troops had to be supplied, populations had to be counted. In an empire covering millions of square kilometers, information was a physical burden. Sometime before the 2nd century BCE, Chinese craftspeople began experimenting with sheets made from plant fibers. Archaeologists have found early paper fragments associated with wrapping, padding, and maps, some dating well before the traditional invention date. These first sheets were rough, some were probably unsuitable for fine writing, but they established the essential principle: soak fibrous material, break it apart, suspend the fibers in water, lift them out in a thin layer, and let that layer dry. Simple ingredients, transformative result. Then, in 105 CE, a court official named Kai Lun presented an improved paper-making process to Emperor He of the Eastern Han Dynasty. Kai Lun did not invent paper from nothing. Archaeological finds have made that older textbook story impossible to defend. His achievement was refinement, standardization, and official promotion. According to a biography compiled centuries later in the Book of the Later Han, Kai Lun used materials including tree bark, hemp waste, old cloth, and worn fishing nets. These were materials that society had already used and discarded. They were soaked, beaten into pulp, mixed with water, collected on a screen, pressed and dried. Think about the chemistry for a second. Plant fibers contain cellulose. When those fibers are separated and suspended in water, they spread across the mold in a chaotic mesh. As the water drains and the sheet dries, bonds form between the cellulose fibers. No glue is required to create the basic structure, no weaving is required. The fibers hold one another together. Waste became a surface for thought. The papermaker first had to gather and sort the raw material. Bark might need steaming and stripping. Rags had to be cleaned and cut. Hemp and old nets had to be softened. Workers then pounded the material until recognizable threads became a wet mass. The smell would have been earthy, sour, and sometimes foul. Water splashed across the floor. Wooden mallets struck fibers for hours. Pulp floated in vats like cloudy soup. A worker dipped a rectangular mold into that vat, shook it gently so the fibers settled evenly, and lifted it into the air. Water poured through the screen. The wet sheet was transferred onto a flat surface, stacked with others, pressed to remove more moisture, separated and hung or brushed against a wall to dry. Each sheet required skill. Lift too quickly and the fibers clumped. Shake unevenly and one side became thick while the other tore. Press badly and the sheet wrinkled. Dry it carelessly and the surface warped. They did not know the language of polymer chemistry. They were manipulating it anyway. Kai Lun's position at court gave the process imperial credibility. Paper could now move through official workshops and administrative networks. It was lighter than bamboo, cheaper than silk, and adaptable to different grades. Fine paper could receive calligraphy and painting. Coarser sheets could wrap goods, pad fragile objects, cover walls, or serve mundane administrative purposes. Kai Lun's own life ended with the kind of palace intrigue that paper would later document in exhausting detail. He had become entangled in struggles among emperors, empresses, eunuchs, and rival court factions. In 121 CE, after losing his political protection, he was ordered to report to prison. Traditional accounts say that he bathed, dressed in formal robes, and killed himself by drinking poison. His process survived him. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, paper was replacing bamboo and wood as China's primary writing surface. The consequences went far beyond convenience. Government became faster, archives could grow larger, scholars could copy more texts, letters could travel with merchants and soldiers. A state capable of producing cheap writing material could issue more orders, keep more accounts, and preserve more institutional memory. Paper gave bureaucracy room to expand. Chinese paper also became an artistic material. Calligraphers exploited the way different sheets absorbed ink. Painters learned to work with surfaces ranging from smooth and resistant to soft and highly absorbent. Paper lanterns glowed over streets. Paper screens divided interiors. Paper offerings were burned for ancestors. Armor was sometimes constructed from layered or folded paper, especially when lightness mattered more than resistance to heavy weapons. Household paper appeared in uses that would feel surprisingly modern. In the 6th century, a Chinese scholar named Yan Jitui complained that paper-bearing quotations from the Confucian classics should never be used for filthy purposes. The complaint strongly suggests that people were already using paper for hygiene. By the 14th century, records from the Ming dynasty describe enormous state production of toilet paper, including perfumed sheets made for the imperial household. The sacred text and the bathroom supply had become members of the same material family. Paper has always had range. Religion accelerated its spread. Buddhist practice placed enormous value on copying sacred texts. Reproducing a sutra could generate spiritual merit for the copyist, the sponsor, and their relatives. More copies meant more merit, wider teaching, and greater institutional influence. Paper made that reproduction cheaper. Woodblock printing made it faster. A page of characters was carved in reverse into a wooden block. Ink was applied to the raised surface. Paper was pressed against it and lifted away, carrying the image. Once a block existed, a workshop could produce copy after copy with remarkable consistency. In 868 CE, a man named Wang Jie sponsored the printing of a Buddhist work known as the Diamond Sutra on behalf of his parents. The surviving copy, discovered centuries later in a sealed cave near Dunhuang, is a scroll roughly 5 meters long, assembled from 7 printed sections. It is recognized as the earliest complete printed book carrying a date, the earliest dated printed book. Printed on hempen mulberry paper in China, nearly 600 years before Gutenberg. This does not mean printing began in 868. The craftsmanship is far too mature. Its detailed frontispiece, clean characters, carefully prepared ink, and precisely sized paper reveal an industry that had already developed specialized artists, carvers, printers, and paper makers. The surviving scroll is evidence of a sophisticated system, not a first attempt. Paper carried Chinese technology east into Korea and Japan. Korean artisans developed exceptionally strong papers and later pioneered metal movable type printing. Japanese paper makers transformed local fibers such as kozo, mitsumata, and gampi into washi, a family of papers valued for strength, flexibility, and beauty. Buddhist monasteries, royal courts, and government offices became centers of production and consumption. Then paper transformed money. Metal coins were durable but heavy. Merchants moving large sums across Tang Dynasty China sometimes deposited coins with agents and carried paper certificates instead. These instruments became known as flying cash because value could move while the metal remained behind. During the Song Dynasty, merchants in Sichuan issued notes called jiaozi. The government eventually took control of the system and began issuing official paper currency in the early 11th century. For the first time, a major state could manufacture money from fiber and trust. The arrangement worked while people believed the notes could retain value. Governments soon discovered the temptation built into the system. Metal money required mining, smelting, and minting. Paper money required paper, ink, and authority. When states printed too much, confidence collapsed and prices rose. The Mongol-led Yuan dynasty later issued paper currency across a vast imperial territory, but repeated overproduction contributed to severe inflation. Paper could represent knowledge, paper could represent law. Now paper could represent wealth, even when the wealth itself was nowhere in sight. But the story of paper gets bigger than East Asia. Paper-making moved slowly westward through trade, migration, diplomacy, and the movement of craftspeople across Central Asia. One famous story places the decisive transfer at the Battle of Talas in 751 CE, when Abbasid forces defeated a Tang army near the border of modern Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. According to later accounts, captured Chinese papermakers were taken to Samarkand and forced to reveal their methods. Now historians debate whether this actually happened. Contemporary records do not document a dramatic transfer of a guarded secret after the battle, and papermaking knowledge may already have been moving through Central Asia. The story appears in sources written much later, but the fact that the legend endured tells you something. People understood that control over papermaking was a strategic advantage. Samarkand became famous for its paper. From there, production expanded through the Islamic world. Paper workshops operated in Baghdad by 794 or 795 during the reign of the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid. Baghdad was one of the largest and most intellectually active cities on earth. Scholars translated works from Greek, Persian, Syriac, and Sanskrit into Arabic. Mathematicians developed algebra. Astronomers refined observations of the heavens. Physicians compiled and challenged medical knowledge. Administrators governed a territory stretching across continents. All of that consumed writing material. Papermakers in Islamic lands adapted the process to available resources, especially linen and hemp rags. They refined beating, polishing, and starch sizing, which reduced the tendency of ink to spread through the sheet. Water-powered machinery may have assisted production in some regions, although the evidence and dating remain debated. What is certain is that paper became deeply integrated into government, commerce, literature, and science. A merchant could record debts. A judge could preserve testimony. A scholar could compare several books without possessing a private fortune. Libraries grew. Booksellers gathered in urban markets. Copyists, binders, ink makers, and calligraphers formed an information economy around the sheet. In a world without electronic storage, paper served as memory that could leave the human body. A calculation no longer had to die with the mathematician. A medical observation could travel farther than the physician. An imperial order could arrive in a province months after the ruler issued it and still retain the same words. Paper made knowledge portable, repeatable, and cumulative. Production spread to Damascus, Egypt, North Africa, and Muslim-ruled Iberia. The city of Zativa, in present-day Spain, became known for high-quality paper by the 12th century. Christian Europe encountered the material through trade and through contact with the Islamic Mediterranean. European acceptance was slow. Parchment carried prestige and an appearance of permanence. Paper seemed foreign, fragile, and vulnerable to moisture or insects. Legal authorities sometimes distrusted it. In 13th century Sicily, Emperor Frederick II ordered certain official documents written on paper to be recopied onto parchment because the paper might not endure. The suspicion was reasonable. Early European users depended on imported sheets of varying quality, and writing with a quill and iron gall ink placed different demands on the surface. Untreated paper could absorb ink like cloth, turning precise letters into spreading stains. Italian papermakers solved the problem. By the late 13th century, Fabriano had become a major European centre of papermaking. Its workshops used water-powered hammers to beat linen and hemp rags into pulp. They coated finished sheets with animal gelatin, creating a harder surface better suited to quills. They also embedded wire designs into their moulds. When held against light, the finished sheet revealed a translucent symbol: a cross, an animal, a tool, a flower. The watermark. Watermarks identified workshops, distinguished grades, and eventually helped authenticate documents. They became medieval trademarks hidden inside the material itself. Modern historians can sometimes date an undated manuscript by comparing its watermark with designs found in known archives. Fabriano's combination of pure water, rag fibers, mechanical beating, gelatin sizing, and careful workmanship produced remarkably durable sheets. Many surviving examples remain in excellent condition after more than 5 centuries. That detail becomes deeply ironic when industrial mills later discovered how to make cheaper paper that could barely survive a human lifetime. European paper production grew, but every sheet still began with rags. Rag collectors travelled from house to house, buying worn linen, sailcloth, rope, and discarded clothing. Workers sorted the heaps, removed buttons and seams, cut the fabric, washed it, allowed it to ferment, and beat it into pulp. The workshop smelled of wet cloth, sweat, stagnant water, and decay. Dust from old textiles filled the air. Women and children often performed the sorting. Their hands encountered dirt, insects, sharp fasteners, and whatever disease the previous owner had carried. The economics were relentless. More literacy created more demand for paper. More paper created opportunities for printers. More printing encouraged more literacy. Europe was approaching an information chain reaction. Then came movable type. Around 1450, Johannes Gutenberg and his partners in Mainz combined metal movable type, oil-based ink, and a press adapted for printing. Gutenberg did not invent printing, movable type, paper, or the screw press. His achievement was integrating several technologies into a commercially effective European system. Around 1455, his workshop completed the book now called the Gutenberg Bible. Scholars estimate that approximately 160 to 180 copies were produced. Most were printed on paper, with a smaller number on vellum. Of the traditional estimate of 180 copies, roughly 150 may have been paper and 30 parchment. That ratio explains everything. Metal type made repeated impressions possible. Paper made a large print run economically and physically manageable. Producing every copy on calfskin would have required thousands upon thousands of animals and a crushing investment before the first book was sold. Printing spread rapidly. By 1500, European presses had produced millions of books across tens of thousands of editions. Religious works, classical texts, calendars, legal manuals, medical guides, romances, and scandalous pamphlets poured into cities. Prices fell, readers multiplied, arguments escaped the institutions that once controlled them. Then Luther arrived. His ideas found a network of printers eager for material that would sell. Short pamphlets could be produced quickly, carried cheaply, and read aloud to people who could not read. Woodcut illustrations communicated across language and literacy barriers. Supporters reprinted his arguments without waiting for permission. Opponents answered on the same material. The Reformation became one of history's first major propaganda wars conducted through mass-produced paper. Authorities tried censorship. They banned books, raided printers, burned publications, and punished sellers. But a printing shop could reproduce a prohibited work faster than a scribe, and loose sheets could hide inside barrels, clothing, or legitimate shipments. Each confiscated bundle represented only a fraction of what had already moved. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what comes next. Paper also gave governments new ways to tax information. Britain imposed stamp duties on newspapers and other printed materials beginning in the 18th century. The tax raised revenue while making cheap political publishing more difficult. Critics called such duties taxes on knowledge because they placed independent news beyond the reach of poorer readers. In 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act for its North American colonies. Legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, licenses, playing cards, and other printed items had to use officially stamped paper purchased with British currency. The physical object made the intrusion visible. A colonist could hold the tax in his hand. Protests erupted. Printers denounced the law. Merchants organized boycotts. Crowds intimidated stamp distributors until many resigned. Parliament repealed the Act in 1766, but the conflict had revealed a dangerous truth. A government that controlled paper could reach into contracts, courts, businesses, taverns, and private transactions. The paper intended to demonstrate imperial authority became evidence around which resistance could organize. Across the Atlantic, revolutionary France issued paper money called assignats, originally backed by property confiscated from the Catholic Church. The government printed more to finance its growing needs. Confidence weakened, counterfeiting spread, and inflation accelerated until the notes became nearly worthless. Again, paper converted authority into value. Again, excessive printing exposed the illusion. Here is the darker reality. Paper increased access to ideas, but it also made exploitation easier to administer. The Atlantic slave trade generated mountains of documents, bills of sale, insurance policies, ship registers, plantation accounts, mortgages, customs records, advertisements for fugitives, and lists assigning monetary values to human beings. Roughly 12.5 million captive Africans were forced onto Atlantic slave ships. About 10.7 million survived the crossing. Clerks recorded many of them as units of cargo. In 1781, the crew of the British slave ship Zong deliberately threw more than 130 enslaved Africans into the sea. The ship's owners then sought compensation from their insurers, arguing that the killings represented a legitimate loss of cargo. The resulting legal dispute, heard in London in 1783, initially revolved around insurance liability. Think about what the paperwork accomplished. Names became numbers, people became inventory, murder became a claim entered into an account and submitted for payment. Paper gave the crime a clean administrative surface. Colonial governments used maps to divide land they barely understood, treaties to legitimize agreements made under coercion, and deeds to transform communal territory into saleable property. Census forms sorted populations into racial, religious, and ethnic categories. Passes determined who could travel. Permits determined who could work. Identification documents determined whose presence was legal. A distant official could alter a boundary with ink, and soldiers could enforce the line on the ground. In British-controlled India, expanding layers of reports, surveys, tax assessments, legal codes, and censuses helped a relatively small foreign administration govern hundreds of millions of people. The paperwork created an appearance of precision. That precision often concealed violence. A field became a taxable unit. A forest became state property. A community became a category. Complex local relationships were flattened into boxes that an empire could read. Paper amplified whoever controlled the pen, the archive, and the seal. This is where the story takes another turn. Until the 18th century, European paper still depended heavily on cloth rags. Demand from schools, governments, publishers, banks, and merchants began outrunning the supply. Nations restricted rag exports. Collectors competed for old fabric. Writers proposed making paper from straw, bark, nettles, and almost any fibrous material they could find. Paper scarcity threatened the very print culture paper had created. In France, Nicolas Louis Robert developed a machine capable of producing a continuous web of paper rather than individual handmade sheets. He received a patent in 1798, but revolutionary instability and disputes with his employer complicated the project. The design reached England, where the brothers Henry and Seely Fordrinier financed further development by engineer Brian Donkin. By 1803 and 1804, working machines were producing continuous paper. The Fordrinier brothers invested heavily and eventually suffered financial ruin, while their name became permanently attached to the technology. A Fordrinier machine pours extremely dilute pulp onto a moving mesh belt. Water drains away as the belt shakes and advances. Press rollers squeeze the wet web. Heated cylinders dry it. Finishing rollers smooth it. At the far end, a continuous roll emerges. No lifting one mold at a time. No separating every wet sheet by hand. Continuous production. Modern machines still operate on the same broad principle, although they can be hundreds of meters long and run at extraordinary speeds. A sheet begins as a mixture containing overwhelmingly more water than fiber and crosses the machine, while suction, pressure, and heat remove that water in stages. Mechanization solved the sheet-by-sheet bottleneck. The fiber shortage remained. During the 19th century, inventors learned to turn wood into pulp economically. In the 1840s, Friedrich Gottlob Keller in Germany and Charles Fennerty in Canada independently experimented with grinding wood for papermaking. Mechanical pulping forced logs against grindstones, tearing out fibers quickly and cheaply. Wood was abundant. Forests could now become newspapers, but wood contains lignin, a substance that helps plants remain rigid. Lignin reacts with oxygen and light, contributing to yellowing and brittleness. Chemical pulping processes later removed more lignin and produced stronger fibers, while bleaching created the bright white sheets consumers came to expect. The transition transformed publishing. Cheap newspapers reached mass audiences. Governments expanded record keeping, Businesses flooded cities with catalogues and advertising. Schools consumed textbooks and exercise books. Wallpaper covered homes. Paper bags, cartons, tickets, labels, receipts, and disposable packaging became ordinary. The paperless person became almost impossible. Industrial production carried new costs. Logging consumed forests. Pulp mills required huge volumes of water and energy. 19th and 20th century mills released foul-smelling sulfur compounds and polluted waterways with organic waste and bleaching chemicals. Mill towns learned to describe the rotten egg odor as the smell of money because wages depended on accepting it. Workers faced machinery capable of pulling a person into rollers in seconds. Logging camps, pulp plants, and paper mills combined falling trees, boiling chemicals, high-pressure steam, blades, belts, and crushing equipment. Cheap paper concealed dangerous labor behind a clean white surface. There was another irony. Medieval rag paper could survive for centuries, while mass-produced acidic wood pulp paper often deteriorated within decades. Librarians call the continuing decay of 19th and 20th century collections a slow fire. Pages yellow, become brittle, and break at the edges. Entire eras of books and newspapers are gradually consuming themselves through chemistry embedded during manufacture. Industrial paper democratized memory while making part of that memory temporary, and paper is far more than writing material. This next part tends to catch people off guard. Electrical insulation, photographic prints, cigarette wrappers, medical dressings, tea bags, banknotes, sandpaper, drywall facing, roofing materials, filters, baking parchment, and laboratory test strips all rely on specialized forms of paper. Capacitors once used paper as a dielectric. Early computer programs and census data were stored on punched cards. Paper honeycomb structures can reinforce doors, furniture, packaging, and aircraft interiors while adding little weight. The cardboard box may be paper's most powerful modern form. Corrugated board sandwiches are fluted in a sheet between flat liners, creating a light structure that resists crushing. It protects food, appliances, medicine, machine parts, and almost everything purchased online. Digital communication was supposed to kill paper. It changed the market instead. Newsprint and office paper demand declined in many wealthy countries as screens replaced newspapers, letters, invoices, and printed reports. But e-commerce created an avalanche of boxes, sleeves, labels, and protective inserts. Graphic paper production fell while packaging remained dominant. The internet reduced one form of paper consumption and expanded another. According to the latest comprehensive figures published by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, the world produced approximately 423 million metric tons of paper and paperboard in 2024. 423 million tons. That is roughly 51 kilograms for every person on Earth if divided evenly, about the weight of a large dog in paper for every man, woman, and child. Consumption is nowhere near evenly divided. China produced roughly 34% of the global total. The United States produced about 14%, India about 6%, Japan about 5%, and Germany about 4%. Packaging grades account for a growing share, while newsprint and printing paper continue to shrink in many regions. Calculating the industry's dollar value is difficult because reports define the market differently. Some count finished paper products, some include pulp, and others include packaging conversion. One commercial estimate valued the broad pulp and paper market at roughly $345 billion in 2024, while narrower estimates for finished products are lower. The exact number changes with the definition. The scale does not. Paper remains one of the world's largest material industries. Recycling supplies a major share of its fiber. Used boxes and papers are collected, sorted, pulped, cleaned, and turned into new products. But recycling is not an infinite loop. Fibers become shorter and weaker each time they are processed. Contamination from food, plastic coatings, adhesives, inks, and synthetic additives can make recovery difficult or impossible. Fresh fiber must keep entering the system. A brown paper package may look environmentally simple while containing wet-strength chemicals, plastic barriers, metallic layers, or adhesives that complicate recycling. Replacing a plastic item with a heavier paper version can also increase shipping weight, water use, or energy demand. Material choices involve trade-offs. Slogans do not remove them. Researchers are now pushing cellulose into forms Kailun could never have imagined. Nanocellulose can reinforce lightweight composites, create transparent films, and help form barriers against oxygen or grease. Paper-based sensors can detect chemicals or biological markers. Experimental batteries and electronic circuits can be printed onto cellulose substrates designed to bend, fold, or biodegrade. Medical laboratories use patterned paper to guide tiny quantities of fluid through inexpensive diagnostic tests without pumps. A sheet can become a laboratory. Future papermaking may rely more heavily on agricultural residues, recycled textiles, bamboo, hemp, and carefully managed forests. Mills are experimenting with closed-loop water systems, lower carbon heat, less damaging bleaching processes, and products designed for easier recovery. None of these solutions removes the basic tension. Humanity wants billions of clean, cheap, disposable paper objects, and every object requires fiber, water, energy, chemicals, transport, and labor. That tension has existed since the first craftsperson lifted a dripping screen from a vat of pulp. Paper began as discarded bark, hemp, cloth, and fishing nets in ancient China. It lightened the burden of imperial bureaucracy. It carried Buddhist teachings into caves, monasteries, and distant kingdoms. It allowed Chinese governments to manufacture money from trust. It crossed Central Asia and entered the workshops of Baghdad. It supported scholars translating medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. It reached Europe through the Islamic world. It passed beneath the water-powered hammers of Fabriano. It entered Gutenberg's press. It carried Luther's attack on Rome. It turned taxes into visible symbols of imperial control. It carried revolutionary pamphlets, constitutions, and declarations. It recorded human beings as cargo. It converted seized land into property. It gave colonial borders the appearance of permanence. It allowed officials in distant capitals to classify, tax, command, and punish people they would never meet. It fed the newspaper press. It consumed rags, then forests. It made literacy cheaper. It made propaganda faster. It filled libraries with books whose own chemistry slowly destroys them. And now it is in your hand. It is the receipt you barely read, the box outside your door, the banknote in your wallet, the tissue beside your bed, the label on your medicine, and the notebook where an idea waits for you to remember it. You may use a sheet for 5 seconds and discard it, but you are touching the descendant of a technology that made large governments, mass religions, global finance, scientific communities, and political revolutions easier to build. Paper remembers whatever power asks it to remember. A poem, a debt, a law, a prayer, a name, a sentence of freedom, a sentence of death. Paper is never just paper. It never was. If this story surprised you, like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which chapter changed the way you see paper. More hidden histories of the ordinary objects around you are coming, and I will see you in the next one.